On my husband's birthday, I found evidence he never meant me to see. The morning started quietly, in that peculiar way mornings do when you sense something is slightly off, though you can't yet put a name to it. The sun filtered softly through the half-closed blinds, scattering pale stripes across the kitchen floor. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the steam curling upward, and felt the familiar warmth spread across my hands. The aroma should have been comforting, but it felt heavier somehow, like a subtle warning. I heard him moving in the bedroom, the faint shuffle of socks against the carpet. Normally, I would have called out a cheerful happy birthday or laughed at whatever small, clumsy noise he made. But today I held back. There was an unusual tension in the air, the way shadows lingered a little longer across the hallway. I wondered if it was just the angle of the morning light or if I was imagining it. My stomach knotted as I leaned against the counter, listening to the quiet rhythm of our house. He emerged from the bedroom with a crooked smile, trying to mask something in his eyes. I noticed the way his fingers lingered on the doorknob before letting go, a small hesitation that should have been inconsequential. He greeted me, voice casual, but there was a slight tightness to it, a hint that he was measuring his words. I smiled back automatically, but the gesture felt forced even to myself. The coffee tasted bitter now, sharper than usual, as though my own nervousness had seeped into it. We moved through the morning in our usual routine, the ritual of birthdays so familiar it almost felt scripted. Cards sat on the counter, some from friends, others from family, and I handed him one with a trembling hand. He thanked me, eyes flicking past mine for just a moment longer than necessary. I noted it, a flicker of unease passing through my chest. Nothing concrete had happened yet, nothing that would alarm anyone else. But to me, every little hesitation was a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was already assembling. The smell of toast drifted from the toaster, the warm scent usually comforting. But today it only reminded me of quiet mornings that had once been simple. I watched him spread butter slowly, deliberately, almost as if savoring something in that small, mundane motion. I felt my curiosity stir, the way it always does when something in the familiar becomes slightly foreign. There was a shift in the air that I couldn't explain, a subtle vibration, like the house itself was aware of the change. I tried to focus on the little things, the ordinary details I had learned to love about him over the years. The way his eyebrows furrowed when he concentrated, the faint dimple in his cheek that appeared whenever he smiled genuinely. Yet even these comforting markers seemed different, almost distorted by the strange weight of anticipation I carried in my chest. I sipped my coffee again, the warmth now mingled with an unnameable anxiety, a prickling sensation beneath my skin that would not settle. He hummed softly to himself as he moved around the kitchen, a familiar tune that usually brought a sense of ease. But today, the hum sounded thin, strained, as if it was keeping something at bay. I wanted to ask him what was wrong, to break through the tension with words, but I hesitated. Something told me that asking too many questions might unravel a fragile thread I wasn't ready to confront. Instead, I kept my silence, listening to the faint clink of silverware against plates and the soft scrape of chair legs on tile. Even the sunlight, which normally would have seemed cheerful and warm, felt muted and diffused. I noticed the way it highlighted the edges of his hair, the slight creases in his forehead that seemed deeper than they had yesterday. I could see him in perfect clarity, yet simultaneously feel a distance growing between us that was invisible to anyone else. It was a delicate, creeping sensation, a quiet pull at my attention that made me hyper-aware of every minor gesture. By the time we sat down for breakfast, the tension had settled into a low hum beneath my consciousness. He chatted casually about plans for the day, mentioning errands and small obligations, but his words felt oddly rehearsed. I caught myself analyzing the inflections, the pauses, and even the way he avoided eye contact when mentioning certain details. My stomach churned with an emotion I couldn't yet name, a mixture of worry and suspicion that hummed under the surface like an unstruck chord. I reached across the table to pass him the sugar, and our fingers brushed for just a moment. Normally, this touch would have elicited warmth, perhaps a small smile or a laugh. Today, it was a jolt of awareness, a reminder that beneath this ordinary morning, something intangible was shifting. I pulled my hand back subtly, heart thudding, and tried to ground myself in the familiar motions of pouring coffee and spreading jam. But grounding felt impossible. As he glanced toward the window, a faint smile on his lips, I noticed a fleeting shadow pass behind his eyes, subtle but unmistakable. It was a hesitation I had never seen before, something private and carefully concealed. I felt the first pangs of a quiet dread, a soft pressure on my chest that grew heavier with every second. I told myself it was just birthday nerves, that I was reading too much into ordinary gestures. Yet the feeling persisted, insistent and unyielding. I sipped the last of my coffee and felt the warmth fade from my hands, leaving only the tension that had settled there like a weight. The kitchen, usually a sanctuary of routine and comfort, felt suddenly alien. Every sound, the click of a cup on the counter, the distant hum of the refrigerator, carried an undertone of something unspoken. I realized, with a slow and sinking certainty, that this morning was unlike any other. By the time he excused himself to shower, I lingered at the table, watching him retreat down the hallway. The air seemed heavier now, the light dimmer, as if the house itself were aware of the subtle unease I could not shake. I traced the edge of the table with my fingers, grounding myself in the tactile familiarity, yet the unease remained. My mind circled in quiet suspicion, wondering why something that should have been ordinary, his birthday a day of celebration, felt so unbalanced. I let the silence stretch, breathing slowly, counting the soft clicks of the water running in the bathroom. I tried to push away the creeping awareness that today would not be ordinary, that beneath the routine and celebration lay something I was only beginning to perceive. And as I sat there, alone with my thoughts, I felt a soft, unspoken shift in the air. A quiet signal that my world, as I knew it, was about to feel different in ways I could not yet name. That I couldn't shake the feeling that something small had shifted, a barely noticeable crack in the foundation of our morning. The sunlight streamed in through the blinds, but it no longer brought warmth. It only highlighted the subtle tension that had settled between us. I watched him move around the house, noticing the little gestures I usually overlooked. The way he rubbed the back of his neck, the slight drag of his feet on the carpet, the moments when his eyes darted to the phone and then quickly away. Each motion seemed loaded with intention. I recalled the minor oddities, but I couldn't yet decipher the message. Missed calls, it was strange, unexplained the way errands, the ordinary became fleeting moments so when he seemed distracted or preoccupied. At the time, I had dismissed them as everyday life, work stress, or my own imagination. But now, looking at him, I felt a creeping certainty that there was more behind these small behaviors. The warmth in my chest that normally accompanied seeing him was replaced with a gnawing anxiety I could not name. I tried to focus on the rhythm of the morning, on the familiar sounds and movements that usually comforted me. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic outside, even the clink of a mug as I set it on the counter. All of it felt amplified in a way that made me acutely aware of how alone I felt in my own home. It was a peculiar isolation, surrounded by someone I loved, yet sensing a distance that was almost imperceptible to the eye. My chest tightened as I realized I could feel him nearby and still feel entirely alone. He spoke occasionally in that casual way he always did, mentioning minor plans for the day, the errands he needed to run, or a quick joke about breakfast. But his words, which normally flowed effortlessly, seemed measured today. Each one weighed before it left his lips. I caught myself analyzing the tone, the pauses, the inflections, as if decoding a secret language I wasn't supposed to understand. The familiarity of his voice was comforting, and yet each syllable carried a subtle undertone that left me unsettled. I poured myself another cup of coffee, letting the steam rise and the aroma fill the kitchen. Usually, this simple act would bring a sense of normalcy, grounding me in the predictability of daily life. Today, it felt like a fragile anchor, barely holding me against a growing unease. I watched him glance toward me from across the room, and I noticed a brief flicker of something in his expression, hesitation, or perhaps something unsaid. It lasted only a moment, but it left an impression that lingered in the pit of my stomach. Even the mundane details of the house seemed to shift under the weight of my suspicion. The floorboards creaked in ways I hadn't noticed before. The ticking of the clock sounded louder, more deliberate. I caught myself listening to the soft scraping of his shoes against the tile, imagining all the possible reasons for his behavior. Each theory seemed equally plausible and improbable, leaving me caught in a loop of doubt and curiosity. It was exhausting, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't ignore the small but persistent signals that something was amiss. I remembered the little moments over the past month. The unexplained text notifications, the way he sometimes left his phone face down, the subtle defensiveness when I asked innocuous questions. At the time, I had dismissed them as minor quirks, nothing worth dwelling on. But now, each memory surfaced with a new weight, a sense that they were pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was already trying to solve. My mind traced the timeline carefully, trying to connect dots I hadn't noticed before. I felt the familiar pang of love intertwined with anxiety. Part of me wanted to ignore the unease, to focus on his birthday, on celebrating the day as if nothing were wrong. Another part of me, sharper now, insisted that I pay attention, that I acknowledge the subtle signals before they became undeniable. I sipped my coffee again, feeling the warmth briefly ease my tension, only to have it return almost immediately. The comfort was fleeting, replaced by a quiet vigilance I could not shake. I observed his movements with quiet intensity, noting the way he interacted with small household objects, the tilt of a mug, the careful placement of utensils, the brief hesitations before opening drawers. Each gesture seemed loaded with an unspoken significance. I found myself imagining the reasons behind them, running scenarios through my mind, trying to prepare for any eventuality. The emotional weight of the morning pressed down on me, a slow, insistent pressure that I could neither ignore nor explain. By the time he left the kitchen for a moment to answer a phone call, I sat quietly, hands wrapped around my mug, staring at the light playing across the counter. I felt the stillness of the room press against me, the silence amplifying every thought, every unease. The ordinary comfort of our shared morning was gone, replaced with a subtle, insidious tension that made my heart race and my mind reel. I realized then, with a quiet sinking feeling, that today would not be ordinary, and that the small, almost imperceptible signs I had noticed were merely the beginning of a day that would change everything. That I often think back to how we first met, to the moment when everything felt simple and full of possibility. It was a brisk autumn afternoon, leaves scattered across the sidewalks, and the air carried that crisp, clean scent that only comes with early fall. I remember the way he smiled at me, a little crooked, a little shy, and how I felt an immediate connection I couldn't explain. There was warmth in that smile, a sense that the world had tilted just slightly in my favor, and for the first time in a long while, I felt seen. Our early months together were marked by small, vivid moments that now feel almost sacred in memory. He would call just to ask how my day was, leaving little voicemails that I replayed over and over. The touch of his hand on mine, light but purposeful, felt grounding and reassuring. I can still recall the faint scent of his cologne on chilly evenings, the way he laughed at my awkward jokes, and how everything about him seemed effortless, like he had stepped into my life at exactly the right moment. Those days were pure and uncomplicated, moments I cherished without fully realizing their value. As our relationship deepened, trust and intimacy built naturally. We shared secrets, hopes, and fears that no one else knew. He had this way of listening that made me feel like I mattered entirely, that my thoughts were worth hearing. The ordinary activities, cooking dinner together, running errands, driving across town for no reason, became rituals that strengthened our bond. I look back now and see how much of my world was intertwined with his, and how much of my emotional well-being depended on the constancy of his presence. Even then, there were small moments I barely noticed, fleeting flashes that, in retrospect, hinted at patterns I was too naive to recognize. Minor inconsistencies, like forgotten conversations, vague excuses, or a fleeting hesitation in his voice, slipped past me. At the time, I rationalized them. Everyone forgets things, everyone has moments of distraction. Love, after all, makes people generous in interpretation, and I gave him the benefit of the doubt without question. Those small oversights, harmless then, now feel like early warning signs, tiny cracks in a foundation I believed unshakable. We moved in together, building a life that felt solid and reassuring. Our home was a reflection of us, warm, lived in, full of reminders of our shared history. Photographs lined the walls, mementos collected from trips and special occasions. Each object carried a story, a memory I could summon at will, reminding me of the trust we had cultivated. I felt safe in that space, surrounded by both physical and emotional evidence of our bond. Yet, even as I reveled in the comfort, there were moments, subtle, almost imperceptible, that hinted life was not as simple as it appeared. I remember one evening clearly, a night that seems trivial but now takes on new weight. We were cooking dinner together, the aroma of garlic and herbs filling the kitchen, and he suddenly paused, phone in hand. His expression shifted for a split second, a flicker of hesitation before he smiled again. I didn't think much of it at the time, laughing it off, attributing it to his tiredness or the distraction of multitasking. But in hindsight, that brief pause was a small sign, a quiet indication that he was capable of holding back, of concealing parts of his life. In those years, I also noticed the way he managed relationships outside our partnership. He was charming, attentive to friends and family, and deeply persuasive. At the time, I admired his ability to navigate social dynamics so effortlessly. Now, I realize how that same charm could be used to manipulate, to obscure truths, and to construct narratives that served him more than anyone else. It's strange how admiration and suspicion can coexist, but in reflection, I see the seeds of unease planted long before I fully understood their significance. Despite these subtle signs, love and attachment clouded my judgment. I wanted to see only the person I believed him to be, the man who had made me feel whole and understood. I clung to those memories, to the certainty of our shared past, ignoring the small disturbances that appeared occasionally. Each lapse, each hesitation, I smoothed over in my mind, creating a narrative that kept me comfortable, a story where trust remained unbroken and life continued predictably. By the time we married and established our routine, those early signs had been buried under layers of domestic life and emotional investment. I was so entwined with him that questioning him, even subtly, felt almost impossible. The comfort of our patterns, the shared mornings, the laughter at minor mishaps, the quiet support, formed a cocoon I was unwilling to puncture. And yet, even within that cocoon, the memory of those fleeting inconsistencies lingered, an almost imperceptible tension I chose not to name, like a shadow behind closed eyes. Now, sitting here reflecting on those beginnings, I recognize how important those early warnings were. They were subtle, easily ignored, and yet, in retrospect, they were the first indicators that all was not as simple as it seemed. Love had blinded me to the potential for deception, made me generous with explanation, and allowed small irregularities to pass unnoticed. It is a strange, unsettling realization that even in the midst of intimacy, one can be entirely unaware of the truths hiding quietly beneath the surface. Life before the storm, as I now think of it, had a kind of predictable rhythm that made its eventual rupture all the more jarring. Our mornings began in that familiar, almost mechanical way. Coffee brewing, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint click of the toaster. He would shuffle into the kitchen, still half asleep, and we would exchange soft greetings, the comfort of routine masking any subtle tension beneath. The house smelled faintly of cinnamon and brewed coffee, aromas that should have brought warmth but now carry an undercurrent of unease. I would make breakfast while he read the paper or checked his phone, seemingly absorbed in minor news or social updates. There was an easy companionship in these moments, a sense that everything was ordinary and safe. And yet, even then, small peculiarities crept into our life. A glance that lingered too long on a text, a quick defensiveness when asked a question, or a subtle sigh that seemed out of place. All fleeting, almost invisible unless you paid careful attention. At the time, I dismissed them. Love has a way of doing that, making us generous with interpretation and patient with minor oddities. The days themselves were a series of predictable rituals. Errands, work obligations, and occasional visits to friends or family. I would often accompany him on short drives, the scent of leather seats mixing with the faint perfume he always wore. Those drives were comfortable, mundane even, yet occasionally, a sudden phone call would jolt him into tension, his eyes darting briefly to the road before returning to the mundane. It was easy to ignore at first, attributing it to work or minor stress, but in retrospect, those calls were pieces of a larger, hidden puzzle. Evenings were meant for relaxation, the soft glow of lamps casting familiar shadows across our living room. We would share meals, talk about the day, or watch television together. The ordinary laughter, the teasing remarks, and the casual touches created a sense of security. But behind this comfort, subtle warning signs were beginning to accumulate. Missed explanations, half-truths about work schedules, or sudden excuses for late nights hinted at patterns I had yet to recognize. I remember feeling small twinges of unease but pushing them aside. I wanted life to feel normal. I recall one particularly ordinary night when he returned from work, carrying groceries. He moved with a careful precision, arranging each item methodically on the counter. I asked a simple question about a purchase he made, and he smiled, answering vaguely. That tiny vagueness should have sparked concern, but instead, I laughed it off, believing he was distracted or simply tired. The air smelled faintly of citrus and fresh bread, a comforting combination that now feels almost ironic. In hindsight, that vague response was one of many early signals I failed to interpret. Even our conversations, which usually flowed easily, began to contain small lapses of honesty. There were times when he would recount events, and I would notice tiny inconsistencies, minor shifts in detail that didn't quite align with reality. At the time, I rationalized them. Memory is imperfect, life is busy, people forget. But now, I see that those inconsistencies were more than simple forgetfulness. They were the quiet beginnings of deception, small fractures that eventually widened into something undeniable. Family interactions also began to subtly change. Friends noticed minor shifts in behavior, though nothing overt enough to raise alarm. He remained charming and attentive in public, but in private, I sometimes caught fleeting expressions. Hesitation, avoidance, a shadow behind a smile. I questioned myself constantly, wondering if I was imagining it, if I was overanalyzing normal human behavior. And yet, the small cues persisted, gently prodding at my subconscious. I also became aware of how he managed our shared responsibilities. Bills, household tasks, and planning often fell under his direction, but occasionally, I noticed inconsistencies. A statement didn't match a receipt, or a task he claimed to complete had not been done. At the time, I attributed it to forgetfulness or distraction. I trusted him as I had always trusted him, and I believed that these minor lapses were inconsequential. Now, those moments feel like early markers of a pattern I should have seen sooner. Through all this, the house retained its sense of normalcy. The familiar smells, the familiar sounds, the comfort of routine. Yet beneath that normalcy, tension was subtly accumulating. It was like a slow, imperceptible leak in a dam. At first, you notice nothing, then a faint dampness, and eventually, an unmistakable flood. I was unaware, wrapped in my own routines, believing the life we built together was steady and secure. Looking back, I realize how those years before the storm were a delicate balance of comfort and warning signs. The ordinary moments, mornings filled with coffee and quiet conversation, evenings with shared meals and laughter, created a sense of security that masked the small cracks forming beneath the surface. Each subtle inconsistency, each fleeting hesitation, was a quiet whisper of the truths I would one day uncover. For now, though, life appeared normal, ordinary, safe, and I held tightly to that illusion, unaware of the storm gathering just beyond the horizon. The first warning sign arrived on a day that otherwise felt ordinary, a day that should have blended seamlessly with our routine. I remember waking up to the familiar scent of brewed coffee and toast, the sunlight creeping through the blinds, but something felt slightly off. He moved around the kitchen as usual, but there was a tension in his posture, subtle and fleeting, like a shadow that passed too quickly for anyone else to notice. I tried to ignore it at first, dismissing it as morning fatigue or stress, but the unease lingered, knotting quietly in my stomach. It was a small thing at first, almost laughably trivial, A missed call notification on his phone, the kind that everyone encounters daily. But what caught my attention was the way he reacted. Normally casual with his phone, he glanced at it, then immediately turned it over, face down on the counter. There was a hesitation in that movement, a deliberate concealment that I hadn't seen before. My chest tightened, a slow, creeping anxiety that felt heavier than the ordinary morning light. I wanted to ask him about it, but something in me held back, an instinctive warning that pushing too soon might close doors I wasn't ready to confront. The rest of the morning continued with its usual motions. Breakfast plates clinking, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the aroma of coffee mingling with the scent of toast. Yet every ordinary sound felt amplified, as if the house itself were whispering a subtle alert. I caught myself scanning his expression for any sign of deceit, for a clue that would explain the tightness I felt in the pit of my stomach. There was nothing overt, nothing anyone else would notice, but to me, the tension was palpable, a quiet hum beneath the familiar rhythm of our lives. As we went about small tasks, I began to notice more minor irregularities, moments that would have seemed insignificant in isolation. He mentioned errands that didn't entirely align with previous plans, gave vague answers about calls he had made, and occasionally froze mid-sentence, glancing briefly at the hallway before continuing. Each of these tiny deviations added weight, and though I tried to rationalize them, the intuition building in my chest whispered a warning I couldn't ignore. There was more beneath the surface than I had realized. The first real spark of suspicion, though, came when I saw a receipt left carelessly on the counter. At first glance, it appeared ordinary, a purchase from a local store we frequented. But a detail caught my eye, a product I had no knowledge of, something unnecessary and out of the ordinary. My fingers lingered on the paper as I tried to process what it might mean. He entered the room, smiling casually, and I quickly hid my curiosity behind a neutral expression. My pulse quickened as I realized this was not something easily explained. I watched him closely for the remainder of the morning, observing the subtle behaviors I had started to notice in previous weeks. The way his eyes darted to his phone before speaking, the way he lingered slightly longer than necessary on certain tasks, the brief pauses before answering my questions. Each motion felt deliberate and calculated. I felt a quiet fear beginning to take root, not a full-blown panic, but a persistent, gnawing awareness that something was wrong, something he had carefully hidden from me. The emotional weight of this awareness was subtle but pervasive. I felt a mixture of disbelief, anxiety, and a slow-burning anger that I didn't fully understand. I wanted to confront him, to ask directly about the receipt, the phone, the small inconsistencies, but I also feared what the truth might reveal. That hesitation, that inability to act immediately, left me suspended in a liminal space between curiosity and dread. I became hyper-aware of the ordinary rhythms of our home, attuned to every minor gesture, every slight shift in tone, as if the house itself were conspiring to reveal secrets. Even the most mundane interactions now carried hidden significance. Passing him a mug of coffee felt loaded with unspoken tension. A smile exchanged over breakfast felt like a fragile bridge over a widening chasm. The ordinary comfort of our routines, the chatter of daily life, the clatter of utensils, the aroma of food, was now tinged with uncertainty. Every ordinary act seemed to carry potential meaning, each movement analyzed and cataloged in my mind, building a mental map of subtle cues that had gone unnoticed until now. By late morning, the unease had become a quiet pressure that I could not shake. I moved through the house carefully, trying to maintain normalcy while simultaneously paying attention to every detail. The sun continued to stream through the windows, its warmth now failing to soothe the knot in my chest. I realized, with a sinking certainty, that the first warning sign was not an isolated incident. It was the opening note in a symphony of deception I was only beginning to hear. Sitting down briefly at the kitchen table, I traced my fingers over the surface, grounding myself in the tactile familiarity of our home. My mind circled the evidence, the behaviors, the small irregularities, trying to connect dots that might not yet fully exist. The ordinary morning had become charged, heavy with meaning, and I understood that this day, which should have been light and celebratory, carried a weight that I could not yet fully comprehend. Yet in that quiet moment, I made a subtle, unspoken decision. I would pay attention, carefully, patiently, before any confrontation. I would observe and I would remember, for the truth would not remain hidden forever. The tension that had been quietly building over the past weeks finally began to take shape that morning. Everything felt sharper, the sounds of the house, the light filtering through the blinds, even the way he moved across the floor. There was a rhythm to his steps, a careful, almost cautious pace, as if he were aware I was watching him more closely than usual. I tried to appear absorbed in my own tasks, pouring coffee and checking the mailbox, but every sense in me was tuned to the slightest deviation from normal. He made a few casual remarks about errands and schedules, his voice smooth and even, yet something in the inflection set off a flicker of alarm in my chest. He avoided eye contact at moments I knew he usually wouldn't, and his hands, which normally moved without hesitation, hesitated over the small motions of clearing dishes. Each tiny irregularity acted like a flash of light on a hidden pattern, and my mind raced to understand what it could mean. There was no concrete evidence yet, just the overwhelming feeling that something was deliberately concealed. It wasn't until I noticed the subtle change in his routine that the unease shifted into something more urgent. He went to the study, a room that usually remained closed until later in the day, carrying a small stack of papers. Normally, I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but the way he paused at the door, glanced toward me, and then carefully arranged the papers out of view made me suspicious. There was an almost imperceptible hesitation in his movements, the kind that speaks of someone protecting something they don't want you to see. I felt my stomach tighten as I realized the day's ordinary rhythm had been disrupted. I watched him for a few minutes, pretending to sip coffee while my attention was fully on him. He shuffled through the papers, pausing, folding, and replacing them with a care that seemed disproportionate to their importance. My heart beat faster, a slow, insistent rhythm of rising anxiety and curiosity. Every gesture, every glance over his shoulder, spoke to secrecy, and I felt a surge of determination. This was no longer just a feeling. I knew something was hidden, and I needed to find it. When he left the study briefly to answer the phone, I seized the moment. The papers were left, slightly askew, almost inviting scrutiny. I approached cautiously, heart thudding in my chest, and my hands hovered over the stack. Even now, I can remember the metallic tang of tension in the air, the faint rustle of the pages as I flipped one over. What I saw made my chest constrict. There was something there, something I hadn't been meant to find. The paper carried details that didn't belong in our shared life. Names, dates, and references that seemed deliberately hidden. I froze for a moment, letting the realization settle. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The evidence was subtle yet undeniable, a first glimpse into a truth that had been carefully concealed. Anger and disbelief mingled with a strange sense of relief. I was no longer imagining things, no longer questioning my own intuition. There it was, in black and white, proof that the small irregularities, the inconsistencies, the minor hesitations I had observed, all pointed to something real, something intentional. The room seemed to shrink around me as I took in more of the papers, each detail intensifying the tension. The light streaming in through the windows highlighted the sharp edges of the documents, and the faint hum of the refrigerator became a background drumbeat to my growing awareness. My breathing felt shallow, quick, and yet I forced myself to move slowly, deliberately, careful not to alert him to my discovery. Each piece of information felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place, revealing a pattern I had only sensed but could not yet fully comprehend. I remembered the weeks leading up to this moment, the missed calls, the vague explanations, the subtle hesitations, and I saw them in a new light. Everything that had once seemed minor now carried weight, every small sign a deliberate attempt to mask the truth. A quiet anger began to rise, tempered by the need to understand fully before confronting him. I had learned over time that patience and careful observation were far more powerful than impulsive action. By the time he returned to the study, I had taken mental notes of everything I had seen, cataloging the details, tracing patterns, and quietly preparing myself. The room seemed charged, heavy with the knowledge that my life, as I had known it, was about to change. He smiled at me casually, unaware, while I kept my own expression neutral. Inside, I felt a mix of fear, betrayal, and a growing resolve. The first concrete discovery had been made, and though it was only a beginning, it marked the point where suspicion transformed into undeniable reality. Sitting back for a moment, I allowed myself a slow, controlled breath. The initial shock had passed, replaced by an awareness that demanded careful action. I knew that this day, his birthday, which had started like any other, had now become the first marker of a deeper, more complex truth. And though I felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down, I also felt a quiet clarity settling in. I would observe, understand, and plan, because the person I had loved had begun to reveal a side of himself he never intended me to see. It was mid-morning when I finally found the first piece of evidence that I knew he had never meant me to see. I had been moving quietly through the house, trying to appear engaged in mundane tasks while my mind circled around the suspicions I had been nursing for weeks. The study door was slightly ajar, and a stack of papers, hastily arranged, caught my eye. I approached cautiously, my pulse quickening as if it already anticipated the truth. The room smelled faintly of his cologne mixed with the lingering aroma of brewed coffee, ordinary and familiar, yet now charged with tension. At first, I thought the papers might be innocuous. Bills, notes, reminders, but the way they were stacked and partially hidden made my intuition flare. I reached for the top sheet, my fingers trembling slightly, and began to read. The first line caused my chest to tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just a random note or a minor inconsistency. It was something deliberate, something carefully concealed from me. I sat down slowly, the weight of realization pressing down, and continued to sift through the stack, each page revealing more of the hidden story. There were receipts, emails, and handwritten notes, details I had no prior knowledge of. Each one carried subtle but undeniable evidence of a life I wasn't meant to see. My stomach churned as I pieced together the implications. At first, I felt disbelief, the mind's natural defense against confronting uncomfortable truths. Surely, I thought, there must be some explanation, some benign reason for this. But as I continued reading, as the pattern began to emerge, disbelief gave way to a sinking certainty that the ordinary life I had believed in was far more fragile than I had realized. The first name I recognized on a receipt made my heart skip. It was someone I knew only superficially, someone whose presence in our daily lives had seemed harmless. But in combination with dates, amounts, and locations, the evidence suggested deliberate concealment, coordination, and secrecy. The fact that he had gone to such lengths to hide this made my chest tighten with a quiet fury I didn't yet fully comprehend. I realized, for the first time that morning, how careful he had been, how subtle and calculated, in keeping this from me. I put a hand to my mouth as I read further, the faint sound of his footsteps approaching sending a jolt of adrenaline through me. I stacked the papers quickly, pretending they were still in disarray, and adjusted my posture so that he would not suspect I had discovered anything. The tension in my chest coiled tighter, a combination of fear and anticipation. I understood now that what I had stumbled upon was only the beginning, that these initial pieces of evidence were the first glimpse into a much larger truth. The room felt smaller somehow, the familiar walls closing in as I absorbed the information. I remembered the small signs I had noticed over weeks, the fleeting hesitations, the strange glances, the missed explanations, and suddenly they all aligned, forming a pattern I could not ignore. My mind raced, cataloging every minor detail I had previously dismissed, reinterpreting each in light of this new evidence. It was as if a veil had been lifted, revealing not just deception, but intention. Anger began to bubble quietly beneath my initial shock. It was tempered by a need for clarity. I knew I could not act impulsively. I had to understand the full extent before confronting him. Each document, each note, each receipt demanded careful attention, careful consideration. I felt my pulse in my ears, the low hum of tension threading through my limbs. Yet beneath it all, a cold clarity settled. This was not merely a lapse in judgment. This was a deliberate concealment, orchestrated with precision. I set aside the initial stack for a closer look, moving methodically through each page. Patterns emerged, dates that coincided with times he had claimed to be elsewhere, minor expenditures that didn't align with our household budget, references to communications that had been deliberately hidden from me. The deeper I looked, the more the web unfolded, each detail adding weight to the growing certainty that my life, as I had understood it, was not entirely truthful. By the time he returned to the study, I had absorbed enough to feel a subtle, resolute determination. My emotions were a mix of disbelief, quiet fury, and the beginnings of strategy. I kept my expression neutral, gesturing casually as he glanced at the papers and began to shuffle them again. Inside, I cataloged everything in meticulous detail, storing each piece of evidence in my mind. I knew I had crossed a threshold. Suspicion had become tangible proof, and the quiet, simmering tension of the past weeks now had a clear and undeniable source. Sitting back for a moment, I allowed a slow breath to escape, the weight of realization settling over me like a heavy, invisible blanket. I understood now that this was no longer speculation or intuition. It was fact. The first tangible piece of evidence had been uncovered, and with it came a subtle shift in my mindset. I was no longer merely observing. I was preparing quietly and deliberately to confront the truth that had been hidden from me for so long. And though the room remained outwardly ordinary, with the faint hum of the refrigerator and sunlight spilling across the floor, I felt an irreversible change take hold. The ordinary life I had known was no longer whole. The moment after discovering the first tangible evidence, I realized that the quiet tension I had been feeling for weeks was only the beginning. What I had found was not isolated. It was part of a larger, carefully constructed pattern. The initial shock had faded into a simmering awareness that the life I thought I knew was slowly unraveling. I felt a mixture of disbelief, anger, and a subtle, insistent fear as I traced each detail, connecting dates, names, and hidden actions that had gone unnoticed for far too long. I watched him closely as he moved through the house, each gesture now heavy with new meaning. The casual glances, the fleeting pauses, the carefully measured words. All of it now seemed deliberate, designed to obscure and mislead. There was a precision in his movements that had gone unnoticed before, a kind of choreography meant to keep me from seeing the full picture. The realization pressed against my chest, and I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. My trust, once steady and unwavering, now teetered on a fragile edge. The emotional impact was immediate. Anger began to rise, not the loud, explosive kind, but the slow, simmering type that courses beneath the surface. It was mingled with disbelief. How could someone I had trusted so completely orchestrate something so calculated? The more I observed him, the more I noticed subtle clues I had ignored. The extra time on the phone, the hurried movements when entering certain rooms, the way he avoided eye contact when small questions were asked. Each instance, which I had previously dismissed, now felt like a thread in an intricate web of deception. I went back to the evidence, examining it again with painstaking care. Receipts, notes, and communications revealed small but undeniable details of a life he had hidden from me. It was all so precise. The timing, the concealment, the deliberate effort to ensure I would remain unaware. My mind traced patterns, calculating the scope of the betrayal. I felt the quiet hum of fear and anger intertwine, a low, steady rhythm that grew stronger with each realization. Every inconsistency, every omission now had weight and meaning. At the same time, I felt a wave of sorrow that I couldn't suppress. It wasn't just anger at the deception. It was grief over the trust that had been broken, the intimacy that had been violated. Memories of shared laughter, late-night conversations, and simple gestures of love now carried a tinge of melancholy, tinged with betrayal. The very routines I had once found comforting, the morning coffee, the quiet conversations, the casual touches, felt fragile, as though each had been part of an elaborate illusion. I observed him interact with the small details of our daily life, now acutely aware of the hidden implications behind each motion. The way he handled the mail, the subtle glances when a phone buzzed, the careful manner in which he moved objects in the study. All these gestures now carried layers of unspoken meaning. I cataloged them mentally, storing each observation, knowing that understanding the full extent of his deception required patience and careful attention. I had to be deliberate, measured, and precise if I wanted to see the entire picture before taking any action. The sense of betrayal deepened as I considered the extent to which he had manipulated not just events, but my perception of them. Each moment I had trusted him, each assumption I had made about our shared life, now felt like part of a carefully crafted facade. It wasn't just the evidence itself, it was the meticulous effort to maintain normalcy, to keep me unaware. That realization stung sharply, a reminder of how easy it is to be deceived by someone you love completely. I also began to recognize the emotional manipulation that had accompanied the concealment. The fleeting smiles, the casual reassurances, the small gestures of affection. They all now seemed to serve a dual purpose, maintaining a sense of normalcy while hiding the truth. My mind alternated between anger, grief, and determination, realizing that confronting this betrayal prematurely could backfire. I needed to understand fully before taking any steps, to plan carefully rather than act impulsively. By mid-afternoon, the quiet awareness of betrayal had settled into a kind of grim clarity. The emotional landscape was shifting. The small anomalies, grief intertwined with clarity, the hidden evidence, fear balanced all by of it determination. Pointed to a deliberate, sitting alone for deception. A moment, I felt I allowed myself to breathe, steady determination absorbing the gravity the of what I had uncovered. A sense that I would need to approach the situation with intelligence, filled with familiar sounds and careful planning. Yet I felt a fundamental shift within it, within him, and within myself. The quiet betrayal had deepened into a full awareness of what had been hidden, and though I was still only at the beginning of understanding the full scope, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I could no longer see our life as it had been. The deception had changed everything, and I needed to act with care. By the time evening approached, the weight of what I had discovered began to press on me more heavily. The house, once a place of warmth and familiarity, now felt constricted, each corner carrying the invisible presence of secrets. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the faint ticking of the clock, and the soft whisper of the air vent became amplified, each sound a subtle reminder that nothing was as it seemed. I moved through the rooms slowly, deliberately, careful to observe without drawing attention to the simmering awareness growing inside me. He appeared throughout the house, moving with his usual casual efficiency, but I noticed now the small tells I had previously ignored. A glance over the shoulder, a pause before answering, a subtle tightening around the mouth. All the minor gestures that had once seemed insignificant now carried undeniable weight. Each action reinforced the realization that I was living alongside a carefully constructed illusion, and the knowledge created a low, persistent pressure in my chest, a mix of fear, anger, and quiet determination. The evidence I had uncovered earlier no longer felt like isolated fragments. In my mind, it connected into a pattern, forming a web that mapped his hidden life with alarming clarity. Dates, names, and communications aligned in ways I had only sensed before. The more I traced the pattern, the more I understood the depth of the deception, and with each new connection, a sense of danger quietly unfurled. It wasn't immediate, dramatic danger. It was the subtle, insidious type, the kind that comes from knowing someone close to you has been orchestrating a hidden life right under your nose. As he moved about the evening routine, preparing dinner and tidying up, I found myself hyper-aware of every gesture. The way he opened cupboards, the careful placement of utensils, the slight hesitation before checking the stove, all of it now carried a double meaning. I cataloged these movements in my mind, trying to understand what else might be hidden, what else had been carefully concealed. The ordinary domestic acts became charged with tension, each one a reminder that appearances could no longer be trusted. My emotional state shifted with alarming speed. Anger rose, mingled with grief and disbelief, while fear lingered like a subtle hum beneath the surface. I realized that the quiet betrayal I had uncovered could not be ignored. It demanded vigilance. My mind raced with questions. What else was he hiding? How far did this deception go? Could our life together survive the unraveling of trust that now seemed inevitable? The answers were not yet clear, but the urgency of understanding them pressed down on me relentlessly. Dinner was prepared and served, and the ordinary routine of eating together felt unnatural. The flavors, normally comforting, seemed muted, as if the tension in the room had drained color from everything. I noticed the small pauses in conversation, the slight avoidance of eye contact, the way he focused on the table rather than on me. Each gesture now carried a weight that it had never held before. I realized with quiet dread that the house, once a sanctuary, had become a theater of careful deception, and I was only beginning to see the full performance. Later, while he went to the study to make a call, I allowed myself a moment to review the evidence again. The receipts, notes, and communications formed a clearer picture, each detail adding layers of understanding to the deception I had uncovered. I realized how deliberate the concealment had been, small, calculated acts designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy. The discovery left me with a heightened awareness of the potential danger in acting prematurely, of the need to remain calm while planning my next steps carefully. The emotional tension settled into a quiet, persistent hum. I felt the vulnerability of my position acutely, living alongside someone whose hidden actions had undermined my trust so completely. At the same time, a growing sense of determination took root. I understood that knowledge alone was not enough. I had to prepare, observe, and strategize, turning awareness into a controlled plan of action. The quiet danger of the situation was palpable, a reminder that patience and intelligence were my strongest allies. I moved through the house with a careful attention to detail, noting the small clues he left inadvertently. The shift in posture when I entered a room, the slight pause before responding to my questions, even the careful arrangement of objects now took on a layered significance. Each observation reinforced the understanding that I was living with a man who had been meticulously guarding a hidden life, and that my own actions needed to be equally deliberate to navigate the situation safely. As night fell, I felt the first hints of exhaustion from the constant vigilance, the mental strain of cataloging every detail, and the emotional weight of betrayal. Yet beneath the fatigue, a sense of resolve persisted. I knew that the next steps required patience and intelligence. The danger was subtle but real, and the path forward would need to be navigated carefully. I sat for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, absorbing the complexity of the situation and the knowledge that my life had irrevocably shifted. The night brought with it a heaviness that I hadn't anticipated. The house, usually quiet and comforting after dark, now felt suffocating, each familiar sound amplified with a new and unwelcome significance. The faint creak of floorboards, the soft hum of the refrigerator, even the gentle whistle of the wind through the windows carried a weight I could not ignore. I moved cautiously through the rooms, each step deliberate, as if even the smallest sound might reveal something I wasn't yet ready to confront. He settled into his usual chair in the living room, a book in hand, but I noticed the slight tension in his posture, the way his shoulders were slightly hunched, his eyes flicking occasionally toward the study. Every gesture seemed loaded with a subtle caution, as if he, too, sensed the fragile balance of the evening. I kept my movements slow and measured, pretending to scroll through my phone while my mind cataloged each small detail, each subtle clue that reinforced the growing awareness that the deception was far from isolated. Earlier, I had reviewed the evidence again, laying out the receipts, notes, and correspondence with methodical care. The pattern was unmistakable, and it left me with a cold clarity. I was living with someone who had carefully orchestrated this hidden life, shielding it with practiced ease. The discovery of the first tangible pieces had been startling. The full picture now revealed a level of planning and deliberate concealment that both enraged and unsettled me. I realized how close I had come to overlooking it entirely. As the evening wore on, small incidents heightened my awareness of the danger that lingered just beneath the surface. A phone call he answered in another room, brief and hushed, left him visibly tense when he returned. A receipt casually left on the counter, which I had noticed earlier, seemed almost like a challenge, a reminder that parts of his hidden life were still at play. Each small moment reinforced the idea that I had crossed an invisible threshold. Suspicion had turned into knowledge, and knowledge demanded caution. The emotional stakes had shifted dramatically. The calm, measured anger that had accompanied my initial discoveries now mingled with a quiet fear. Fear not of physical danger, but of the betrayal's capacity to reshape the very foundation of our shared life. Trust, once unshakable, had been fractured, and the realization was overwhelming. I felt a strange tension. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately, to demand answers, while another part knew that patience and observation were far more powerful tools than impulsive confrontation. I began moving through the house with heightened vigilance, paying attention to every small gesture, every minor deviation from the norm. The way he arranged objects, the subtle glances at his phone, the brief hesitation before answering questions. All of it seemed calculated, and each act underscored the necessity of careful observation. The threat was not overt, but its presence was undeniable. I understood that acting too soon, too recklessly, could destabilize the situation in ways I was not prepared to handle. The hours stretched, the quiet of the night intensifying the emotional strain. Even the mundane became charged with meaning. A glass left on the counter, a newspaper folded a certain way, the soft creak of a door. Each small signal contributed to a growing mental map of the hidden activity I had uncovered. I cataloged everything with deliberate precision, understanding that knowledge alone was insufficient without careful preparation for the next steps. There was a subtle tension in the air between us that I had never experienced before. The ordinary interactions, the passing of dishes, the shared smiles, the casual conversation, were now fraught with a dual layer of meaning. I maintained my composure, hiding the swelling mixture of anger, grief, and fear, while simultaneously observing every nuance of his behavior. The quiet dance of deception and awareness continued, each side testing the other without explicit confrontation. At one point, he left the room to check a noise outside, and I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath. The house was filled with a stillness that pressed down on me, the calm before what I knew would be inevitable revelations. I reviewed in my mind the evidence I had gathered, the subtle signals I had cataloged, and the patterns I had traced. It became clear that the day's discoveries were not isolated. They were part of a carefully maintained secret that had endured for weeks, perhaps months. Sitting alone in the living room, I realized that the threat, though subtle, was real and present. It was not a matter of physical harm but of emotional control, deception, and betrayal. The ordinary home, the routines, the shared life, all had been carefully manipulated to hide the truth. I understood that I could no longer operate in ignorance. The night had brought clarity, a quiet but unshakable understanding that my next actions would need to be deliberate, intelligent, and patient. For the hidden truth could not remain concealed forever, be why the late hours of the night. The weight of the truth pressed down on me in a way that was almost unbearable. The house, which had once felt warm and familiar, now seemed alien. Every corner a potential witness to the hidden life I had uncovered. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the subtle creaks of the floorboards, even the soft rustle of the curtains in the wind, all took on a heightened significance. Every ordinary sound seemed to underscore the reality I had been grappling with. The trust one had placed in him had been carefully manipulated. I sat quietly in the living room, the stack of evidence beside me, tracing once again the web of deception he had spun. Receipts, notes, and messages, when examined together, revealed a pattern so deliberate it was chilling. The dates aligned with his carefully constructed alibis. The communications showed planning and concealment, and the small inconsistencies I had previously ignored now screamed at me. It was no longer just suspicion or intuition. This was undeniable proof of betrayal, a calculated act designed to hide the truth from the person he had promised to love. As I reflected, anger surged, tempered by grief and disbelief. The quiet, simmering resentment I had felt in previous days now solidified into a profound understanding of the magnitude of his betrayal. How long had this been going on? How carefully had he guarded his secrets? Every memory, every shared laugh, every casual smile now carried the weight of deception. I felt a strange mix of sorrow and indignation, the pain of realizing that someone I loved had been deliberately dishonest, and the indignity of being kept in the dark for so long. The subtle danger of the situation became more pronounced as I observed him moving through the house. The ordinary gestures, the placement of objects, the way he paused before responding to questions, the measured cadence of his voice, all took on new significance. Each movement, previously comforting in its familiarity, now felt like part of a carefully orchestrated performance. I cataloged every detail in my mind, understanding that knowledge alone would not suffice. I needed to see the full extent of the betrayal before acting. I revisited each inconsistency that had seemed minor in the past. The missed calls, the vague explanations, the fleeting glances, all aligned perfectly with the evidence I had found. Patterns emerged clearly, forming a map of deception that revealed not only what had been hidden, but also how meticulously it had been concealed. The realization intensified my emotions, blending fear, anger, and determination into a complex but coherent resolve. I understood that confronting him prematurely would be unwise. Patience and strategy were essential. Even routine interactions became charged with tension. Passing him a dish, exchanging a casual remark, or responding to his questions felt weighted with unspoken meaning. Every gesture, every word, carried the potential for revelation or misstep. I became acutely aware of how carefully he had maintained normalcy, the ease with which deception could be woven into everyday life, and the challenge I now faced in navigating that delicate balance. The night deepened, and with it came a growing awareness of the stakes. This was no longer a simple betrayal. It was a comprehensive, calculated act that had infiltrated the very fabric of our shared existence. The emotional impact was almost overwhelming. The grief of lost trust, the anger at deliberate deceit, and the fear of the unknown consequences all collided into a heavy weight I carried silently. Yet beneath it all, a quiet determination persisted, a recognition that careful observation and measured action were now imperative. At one point, he left the room briefly to retrieve a book, and I allowed myself a slow, deliberate breath. The house was silent except for the faint hum of appliances and the occasional creak of the floor. In that quiet, I reviewed everything I had learned, mentally cataloging the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the patterns of behavior. The emotional clarity that accompanied this review was both sobering and empowering. I now understood the depth of the betrayal, and I recognized that my next steps would determine the course of our shared life from this point forward. The knowledge weighed heavily, but it also brought a certain grim clarity. I realized that the ordinary life we had maintained was an illusion, carefully constructed and meticulously preserved to conceal the truth. The betrayal had reached its emotional peak. I felt every nuance of the deception, every calculated gesture, and every instance of trust broken. It was overwhelming, yet the clarity it provided was essential. Sitting alone in the dim light of the living room, I allowed myself a moment to absorb the gravity of the situation. The betrayal was complete, the deception fully revealed, and the emotional stakes could not have been higher. My mind was a careful balance of grief, anger, fear, and determination. I understood now that moving forward would require intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. The quiet night pressed in around me, but inside, I felt a growing resolve. The next steps would be deliberate, precise, and unwavering. The morning after the long, tension-filled night, I felt a mixture of dread and cautious resolve as I approached the study once again. Something inside me had shifted overnight. The simmering awareness of betrayal had crystallized into a determined need for clarity. I wasn't looking for confrontation yet. I needed to understand everything, to see the full scope of what had been hidden from me. The house was quiet, the faint light of dawn filtering through the blinds, casting long shadows across familiar furniture that suddenly seemed strange. As I sifted through the papers, I noticed a folder that had previously escaped my attention. It was tucked neatly beneath other documents, almost as if it were meant to be discovered only if someone looked carefully enough. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled it out and opened it, the smell of paper and ink rising faintly, ordinary yet now charged with significance. Inside, I found something that transformed suspicion into undeniable truth. A collection of documents, messages, and even photographs that revealed not only the extent of his deception, but also the deliberate steps he had taken to construct a hidden life I had never imagined. The first photograph made my chest tighten. It was him, clearly engaged with someone I didn't know, in settings I had no reason to be aware of. The expressions, the gestures, the casual familiarity. All pointed to an intimacy he had never disclosed. I traced the edges of the photograph, the fine grain of the paper, and felt a mix of disbelief, shock, and a deep, aching betrayal. I had known him as a partner, a husband, a familiar presence in my life, but this image revealed a side of him that had been carefully concealed, nurtured in secrecy, and never meant for me to see. I continued through the folder, each page adding to the gravity of the revelation. Receipts aligned with the photographs, dates that contradicted his stories, and messages that confirmed he had been orchestrating meetings and exchanges without my knowledge. The sheer meticulousness of it struck me. It wasn't an accident or a fleeting indiscretion. It was a sustained, deliberate deception, maintained over months. The shock was almost physical, a pressure in my chest that refused to release, a reminder that the life I had believed in had been only partially real. The emotional weight was immense. Grief washed over me first. The grief of realizing that someone I trusted completely had carefully hidden aspects of their life. Anger followed, sharp and quiet, simmering beneath the surface as I cataloged each deceitful act. And alongside those emotions was a profound clarity. I now understood not just the betrayal itself, but the level of planning and cunning that had gone into it. Each piece of evidence reinforced the truth. This was intentional, precise, and long maintained. As I absorbed the documents, a subtle sense of empowerment began to emerge. Knowledge, I realized, was my greatest ally. The full scope of his deception had been revealed to me, and with that clarity came the potential to act thoughtfully and deliberately. I didn't need to rush, to confront impulsively, or to react with uncontrolled emotion. Every detail, every observation I had made over the preceding weeks, had prepared me for this moment of revelation. The truth was fully visible now, laid bare in black and white, and I understood its implications completely. One of the final documents in the folder contained handwritten notes, plans, reminders, and even intentions that revealed how calculated the entire scheme had been. He had considered how each small action would appear to me, how he could maintain the illusion of ordinary life while secretly engaging in activities I had no knowledge of. It was a masterclass in concealment, a quiet manipulation of perception and trust. The clarity of it left me simultaneously unsettled and determined. I could see how everything had fit together, and I knew that understanding it fully was the first step toward regaining control. I paused for a long moment, letting the realization settle. The house was filled with the soft morning light, and yet the air felt heavier, charged with the weight of truth. I thought of our routines, the small gestures of affection, the casual moments I had once trusted implicitly, all of which now carried a shadow of deception. The stark contrast between what I had believed and what was real created a strange, almost surreal emotional tension, one that combined grief, shock, and a slowly rising sense of agency. By the time I set the folder aside, I understood that the full truth had been revealed, and with it came a responsibility, not only to myself but to the life I had built carefully around him. The major twist was no longer hidden. It was clear, undeniable, and precise. I had the evidence, the understanding, and the clarity to make deliberate choices moving forward. The emotional peak of betrayal had been reached, and I now stood at a crossroads, aware that the next steps would determine everything. Sitting quietly in the study, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, absorbing the enormity of the revelation. The truth, fully revealed, brought a complex mix of sorrow, anger, and clarity. I felt the first glimmer of control returning, the sense that while the betrayal had been meticulous, so too could be my response. The major twist, the hidden life, the carefully orchestrated deception. All were now visible, undeniable, and ready to be confronted with intelligence, patience, and precision. The moment after absorbing the full extent of his deception, I felt a strange mix of emotions that I could barely name. Shock had faded into something heavier, a combination of grief, anger, and the lingering hum of disbelief. The house, once familiar, now seemed alien, every corner carrying the weight of secrets I had never imagined. Even the light streaming through the windows felt different, harsher somehow, highlighting the contrast between the ordinary life I had trusted and the hidden reality that now lay fully exposed before me. I walked slowly through the rooms, touching familiar objects with a strange sense of detachment. Each item, books on the shelf, dishes in the cupboard, the soft throw on the couch, carried a subtle reminder of the trust that had been broken. I remembered small moments, gestures I had once found comforting, and now they felt tinged with betrayal. My mind kept returning to the same question. How had I not noticed this before? The realization that his deceit had been both deliberate and sustained left me reeling. The emotional consequences of the revelation were immediate. Anger simmered beneath the surface, quiet but persistent, a steady rhythm that underscored every thought. I felt the sting of betrayal in my chest, a dull ache that seemed to expand with every memory of shared moments now seen in a new, distorted light. Alongside it was grief, the grief of recognizing that someone I had trusted completely had maintained a hidden life, a side of himself that I was never meant to see. The combination of these emotions made it difficult to focus, yet I knew I had to remain deliberate and measured. I revisited the folder of evidence, laying each document out carefully, almost ritualistically. Receipts, messages, and photographs formed a map of his deception, each piece adding to the understanding of how meticulously he had constructed this hidden reality. My mind cataloged every detail, analyzing not just what he had done, but how he had done it, and the lengths he had gone to ensure I remained unaware. The clarity was painful, but it was also empowering. Knowledge had given me a form of control that I hadn't felt in weeks. Even the ordinary interactions between us now carried a weight I could no longer ignore. The way he spoke, the small gestures of affection, even the casual routines we shared, all had to be reevaluated through the lens of what I now knew. Every moment of normalcy was layered with the memory of deception, and I realized that I could no longer operate under assumptions of trust. My perspective had shifted, and with that shift came a responsibility to act thoughtfully, with intelligence and precision. The emotional fallout continued as I reflected on the implications of his hidden life. It wasn't just the act of betrayal itself. It was the careful planning, the deliberate concealment, and the sustained effort to maintain an illusion that struck me as both shocking and methodical. I recognized the magnitude of the psychological manipulation, the subtle ways he had controlled perception, and the way ordinary life had been used to shield the truth. This awareness deepened the emotional impact, leaving me feeling both vulnerable and resolute at the same time. I also felt a growing sense of clarity about the path forward. While the betrayal had been devastating, the revelation had given me a precise understanding of the situation. I now knew what had been hidden, how it had been hidden, and what patterns of behavior to observe moving forward. This clarity transformed my grief and anger into a quiet determination, an understanding that I could navigate this with intelligence, patience, and strategy rather than impulse. Sitting in the study, I allowed myself to process the emotional intensity of the moment. The room, filled with morning light and the faint scent of coffee lingering from the previous evening, felt both ordinary and charged with tension. I reflected on the weeks of subtle suspicion, the moments of doubt, the small signs I had noticed but not fully understood. Now, with the full truth revealed, those moments took on a new significance, each one a breadcrumb leading to the broader picture of deceit. The psychological weight of knowing the truth was profound. I felt the tension in my chest, the slight tremor in my hands, and the ache behind my eyes from sleepless nights of observation and contemplation. Yet beneath it all, there was a growing sense of control, a recognition that understanding the full extent of the betrayal allowed me to act deliberately. I no longer felt passive. I had knowledge, and with it came the power to respond intelligently and strategically. By the end of the morning, the initial shock had softened into a quiet, simmering resolve. The major twist had fully revealed itself, and the emotional fallout was complete. I was left with grief, anger, and disbelief, but also with clarity and determination. I understood now that patience, careful observation, and thoughtful planning would be my tools moving forward. The revelation had changed everything, but it had also prepared me for the next phase, turning the knowledge of betrayal into a deliberate, intelligent response that could restore my sense of control and dignity. After the full revelation of his hidden life, I spent the following days in a careful, deliberate state of observation. I moved through the house with a quiet vigilance, noting every gesture, every pause, every subtle behavior. Each routine, each interaction, now carried a layer of significance I had never noticed before. I didn't rush into confrontation, and I didn't allow myself to act impulsively. Instead, I let patience guide me, understanding that the most powerful response to betrayal is measured, intelligent, and precise. I began subtly reclaiming control over our shared spaces. Small adjustments, reorganizing files, locking certain drawers, and changing access to personal accounts were not about punishment, but about establishing boundaries and protecting myself. Each deliberate action reminded me that I could navigate the situation strategically. The knowledge I had gained gave me an advantage he was unaware of, and I intended to use it thoughtfully rather than recklessly. It was a quiet form of justice, one that didn't require confrontation to assert authority and regain control over my life. The days that followed were filled with careful documentation. I cataloged every piece of evidence, creating a mental and physical record of what had been hidden from me. Receipts, notes, and photographs were placed in a secure location, organized meticulously so that I could reference them if needed. This process was both practical and therapeutic. It allowed me to transform the emotional turmoil I felt into structured action. The act of organizing, of preparing, reinforced my sense of agency and reminded me that I was no longer a passive participant in the deception. I also began to observe him more deliberately, paying attention to patterns that might indicate further concealment or dishonesty. Every small detail mattered: the subtle hesitation before answering questions, the way he positioned objects on tables, the timing of phone calls. Each observation strengthened my understanding and allowed me to anticipate potential manipulations. I realized that quiet intelligence, patience, and careful attention were more powerful than confrontation or anger. The deception had been deliberate. My response needed to be equally calculated. Meanwhile, I reclaimed small moments of personal empowerment. I spent more time on my own routines, reinforcing boundaries and reestablishing a sense of independence that had been subtly eroded over time. Walks, reading, and journaling became tools for reflection and strategic thinking. Each activity allowed me to process the emotional weight of betrayal while also preparing mentally for the steps I might take if further evidence emerged or if confrontation became necessary. It was a slow, steady reclaiming of control, quiet but deliberate. As I implemented these measures, I noticed subtle changes in his behavior. He seemed less at ease, perhaps sensing that the equilibrium had shifted. I did not provoke him, nor did I make accusations. Instead, I maintained calm composure, allowing him to operate within the new boundaries I had established. The quiet tension was effective. Without a word, I had begun to assert authority and reclaim agency over my life. The knowledge of his deception, combined with careful, deliberate action, had transformed the dynamic between us. There was also a sense of emotional release in this process. While I still carried grief and anger, the deliberate steps I took allowed me to channel those feelings into empowerment rather than chaos. Each strategic adjustment, each moment of quiet observation, became a way to assert my own intelligence and integrity in the face of betrayal. I realized that revenge need not be loud or dramatic. It could be subtle, effective, and psychologically precise. In private moments, I reflected on the full picture of the betrayal and the steps I had taken to address it. I understood the magnitude of what had occurred, and I also recognized the importance of moving forward without allowing the emotional weight to control me. Every boundary, every adjustment, every act of documentation was a calculated step toward restoring balance in my life. I was no longer at the mercy of deception. I had created a framework that allowed me to act with deliberate, intelligent precision. By the end of the week, I felt a quiet satisfaction. There had been no dramatic confrontation, no explosive scene, but the shift in control was undeniable. I had observed, understood, and acted strategically. The deception that had once given him a hidden advantage was now neutralized through careful planning and deliberate action. The quiet revenge, measured and thoughtful, had restored a sense of balance and agency. I realized that the most profound form of justice is often silent, steady, and calculated, rather than dramatic or impulsive. Sitting quietly in the study one evening, I reflected on the transformation I had undergone. Betrayal had exposed deep cracks in trust, but it had also revealed my own resilience, intelligence, and capacity for measured action. The quiet revenge had not only restored control but had also reaffirmed my sense of self. I understood now that while the deception had been meticulous, my response could be equally deliberate, intelligent, and effective. The slow, calculated reclamation of agency had become my form of justice, and it was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. The days after reclaiming control settled into a strange new normal. The house, once filled with tension and uncertainty, now felt quieter, more manageable. The subtle power of knowledge and careful observation had shifted the balance. I moved through the rooms with a calm awareness, no longer haunted by unanswered questions, but instead carrying the clarity that comes from understanding the full scope of deception. The betrayal had left its mark, but it had also taught me a profound lesson about patience, vigilance, and the strength that comes from deliberate action. I reflected on the emotional journey I had endured. Shock had given way to disbelief, disbelief had turned to anger, and anger had slowly softened into clarity and resolve. There was still grief for the trust that had been broken and for the life I had imagined, now irrevocably altered. Yet alongside that grief was a quiet pride in my own resilience. I had navigated the deception with intelligence, patience, and strategy, and in doing so, I had preserved my dignity and sense of self. The experience, though painful, had strengthened my understanding of what I valued and how I intended to protect it. The quiet revenge I had enacted, reclaiming control over our shared life, setting boundaries, and observing with careful attention, had proven effective. It required no confrontation, no drama, and no impulsive action. Instead, it relied on deliberate, thoughtful steps, each one calculated to restore balance and assert agency. In the end, the subtle power of strategic action had proven far more impactful than any moment of emotional retaliation could have been. It was a lesson in patience, in using intellect and observation to regain control, and in ensuring that justice does not need to be loud to be effective. I also reflected on the nature of trust and deception. Betrayal is often subtle, hidden in ordinary moments and small gestures that may seem insignificant at first. Recognizing the signs requires attention, awareness, and intuition. My journey taught me that trust is precious, but vigilance is necessary to protect it. It's not about paranoia, but about being attuned to patterns and inconsistencies, and responding thoughtfully rather than impulsively when something feels off. The experience reshaped my understanding of relationships and personal boundaries in a way that I would carry forward for the rest of my life. As I moved forward, I focused on reclaiming my own space, both physically and emotionally. I spent more time on my own routines, cultivating independence and clarity of mind. Simple acts, morning walks, journaling, and moments of reflection became tools for processing the past and reinforcing my personal strength. Each day, I reminded myself that knowledge and careful observation were my allies, and that reclaiming agency in small, deliberate ways was a powerful form of empowerment. I also allowed myself to appreciate the subtle victories. There were no dramatic confrontations, no explosive scenes, yet the sense of control I had regained was undeniable. The deception that had once given him an advantage had been neutralized, not through aggression, but through intelligence, patience, and careful strategy. I understood that true power often lies in restraint and precision, and that justice can be quiet yet profoundly effective. The realization brought a deep sense of satisfaction, tempered by the lessons learned from the emotional journey I had endured. The moral of the experience became increasingly clear as time passed. Life is rarely as simple as it appears, and people are capable of both love and deception simultaneously. Recognizing and responding to betrayal requires emotional intelligence, patience, and strategic thinking. Acting impulsively can lead to regret, whereas thoughtful, deliberate action preserves both dignity and personal agency. I had learned that the greatest form of revenge is often internal. Reclaiming your own power, understanding the truth fully, and navigating the aftermath with intelligence and poise. As the final days of reflection settled in, I realized how much the experience had transformed me. I was no longer the person who had blindly trusted without question. I had grown stronger, more aware, and more capable of navigating deception in a measured and effective way. The lessons I had learned about trust, observation, patience, and strategy were ones I would carry forward, shaping how I approached relationships and personal boundaries in the future. The quiet victory had been earned through intelligence, not impulse, and its impact would be lasting. Before I finish, I want to leave you with this. Trust your instincts, pay attention to small details, and never underestimate the subtle signs of deception. Knowledge is power, and careful observation can be the difference between vulnerability and agency. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the people in your life, the patterns you may have overlooked, and the value of understanding the full truth before taking action. If you found this story compelling, consider subscribing for more real-life accounts of trust, betrayal, and the quiet ways people reclaim control over their lives. Each story shares lessons in patience, strategy, and the resilience of the human spirit. Your awareness and insight may be the key to navigating challenges in your own life. Remember, understanding and patience are powerful tools, and the greatest victories are often quiet, deliberate, and carefully earned.
We made it! Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. It smells wonderful. I'm so glad we're here.